At my own son's wedding, amidst the clinking of champagne glasses, my new daughter-in-law called me the family's rustic antique, and the laughter from her friends felt colder than an Ohio winter. What she didn't know was that the man she had just insulted was the very same anonymous investor her father had been desperately trying to meet with for the past 2 years. I was standing there at my own son's wedding, the sound of champagne glasses clinking all around me. And then I heard her, my new daughter-in-law, Jessica, refer to me as the family's rustic antique. The laughter from her friends felt colder than an Ohio winter. She didn't know that the man she'd just insulted was the same anonymous investor her father had been desperately trying to meet with for the last 2 years. Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story. This is the first time I'm really telling it, from beginning to end. If you're out there listening, maybe hit that like button and let me know what city you're hearing this in. It's good to know you're not alone. It all started with the small things, weeks before the wedding, the little ripples before the wave hits. During one of the family get-togethers, I tried to offer some practical advice. I've built 2 houses with my own hands and fixed more engines than I can count. I figured I knew a thing or two about cost and quality. When I mentioned they could save a good chunk of money by going with a different floral supplier, a man I knew who did honest, beautiful work, Jessica just gave me a smile. It was a perfect smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's such a cute idea, Dad Jamie," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "But we're aiming for something a little more refined." That word, cute, sliced at me like a piece of broken glass. It wasn't just a rejection of my advice. It was a dismissal of my entire life's experience. Everything I'd learned from decades of calloused hands and honest work, reduced to a cute idea. In that moment, I felt myself shrinking. I was no longer a man with valuable knowledge. I was just an old-timer, out of touch with their sophisticated world. The wedding reception was in a place that made me feel like I needed to wipe my feet on the way in. It was stunning. I'll give them that. The kind of place where a single chair probably cost more than the best set of tools in my workshop. I felt like a rusty wrench on a table set with sterling silver. Men in sharp tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns floated around, talking about trips to Europe and the fluctuations of the stock market. My world was the smell of motor oil and sawdust, the satisfying roar of a repaired engine coming back to life. I stood by myself near the bar, nursing a beer, just watching. I saw my son, Dylan. He looked so comfortable, so polished in his tuxedo, laughing with his new friends. He belonged in this world, and a quiet, heavy realization settled in my gut. Maybe I didn't belong in his world anymore. It's a lonely feeling, watching your own kid cross a bridge into a life so different from yours that you can't seem to find the way across yourself. That's when I heard Jessica's voice. She was leading a little tour for a group of her friends, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. They stopped not too far from me, and she spoke just loud enough with that practiced casualness that's meant to be overheard. "And over there," she said, with a little wave in my direction, "is my new father-in-law, Jamie. He's the family's rustic antique. We have to keep him around, of course." A few of her friends giggled. It wasn't a warm, affectionate joke. It was a label, a public branding. She'd turned me into a curious piece of decor, something quaint and old to be pointed at. For a second, the music, the chatter, all of it faded away. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. A hot, prickly wave of humiliation washed over my face, a feeling I hadn't known since I was a clumsy kid in a schoolyard. My dignity, my very identity as a man, had just been put on display and cheapened. I didn't react. My generation, we were taught to be tough, to swallow it, to not make a scene. So I just stood there, my hand tightening around my beer glass until my knuckles were bone white. My eyes found my son again. He was across the room, smiling, deep in conversation with someone, completely unaware of what had just happened. And somehow, that hurt more than Jessica's insult. The profound loneliness of that moment was crushing. The feeling of being completely invisible on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my son's life. All I wanted was to leave, to drive back to my workshop, where the solid, honest language of metal and wood made sense, where things didn't judge you. But I couldn't. I was the father of the groom. So I took a slow, deep breath, the air feeling thick in my lungs, and I swallowed the bitterness. A few moments later, I saw Jessica's father, Robert, making his way toward me. He looked flustered, his brow furrowed with worry. "Quite a party, isn't it?" he said, but his eyes were darting around, not really looking at me. Then his gaze fell on the name tag pinned to my jacket. He squinted. "Jamie Evans," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. He repeated it, and all the color drained from his face. Evans. Jamie Evans. As in, the Titan Innovations patent, you're that Evans. His voice trembled on the last word. I just gave him a slow, simple nod. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jessica drift closer, drawn by her father's strange reaction. I watched her face. I saw the exact moment the information clicked into place. The look of condescending amusement vanished, replaced instantly by something else. A sharp, cold glint of calculation. It was the look of a predator reassessing its prey. In that instant, I knew. I was no longer the rustic antique in her eyes. I had just become a prize. A few days after the wedding, Dylan came to the house alone. He looked tired, a deep-set weariness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. He sank into the armchair across from me, the one my wife Sarah always used to sit in. The silence in the room felt heavy with unspoken things. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" he finally asked, and his voice was laced with something I couldn't quite place. Not just confusion, but a hint of accusation. $850 million I had to hear that from my in-laws. I tried to find the right words. I told him I wanted him to make his own way, to stand on his own 2 feet without the shadow of that kind of money looming over him. I explained that I was afraid it would change him, that I wanted him to know the deep satisfaction of a hard day's work, the pride that comes from building a life for yourself. But as the words left my mouth, they felt flimsy, like a poorly built frame that couldn't support the weight of his disbelief. Just then the front door opened and Jessica walked in. She must have been waiting in the car. She came and stood beside Dylan, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "Honey," she said, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness, "don't be so hard on your dad. Maybe he just didn't feel like we were close enough to trust with the news. Managing a large estate is a huge responsibility, after all." Her words were a masterpiece of manipulation. On the surface, she was defending me, but underneath, she was planting a seed of doubt, framing my silence as a personal failing, a lack of trust in my own son. She was casting herself as the understanding mediator while skillfully driving a wedge between us. I saw the performance for what it was, a subtle, venomous play. But Dylan didn't. I saw the tension in his shoulders ease just a little under her touch. After that day, their visits became more frequent, and Jessica was always strangely helpful. One afternoon, I settled into my old lazy boy recliner, the one that's molded perfectly to my back after all these years. I reached for my reading glasses on the end table beside it, right where they've been for the last 20 years. But they weren't there. I scanned the room, a flicker of confusion turning to irritation. I finally spotted them on a high bookshelf, well out of my reach. "Oh, I was just tidying up a bit," Jessica called out cheerfully from the kitchen. It was such a small, seemingly innocent act, but a cold dread washed over me. It wasn't about cleaning. It was a message, a quiet assertion of control. She was telling me, without saying a word, that this was no longer my space alone, that the simple, predictable patterns of my life were now subject to her approval. Another time, while Dylan was there, Jessica picked up a letter from my investment firm that was sitting on the coffee table. She frowned at it with feigned confusion. "Dad, Jamie, what does all this mean?" she asked, her voice the picture of innocence. "I just don't understand these terms at all." It was a deliberately complex question, designed to make any simple answer seem evasive. When I replied, "It's just business stuff," she turned to Dylan, her eyes wide with a look of shared concern, as if to say, "See, he's hiding things from us again." She was building a case against me in my own son's mind, brick by brick, turning my right to privacy into proof of my untrustworthiness. The worst of it came on a Saturday afternoon. I was in my workshop, the one place I still felt was truly mine, carefully wiping down my tools. The window was open to the backyard, letting in a slight breeze. I heard them talking just outside. Jessica's voice was pitched with theatrical concern. "I'm worried about him, Dylan," she said, just loud enough for me to hear. "He seemed a little confused yesterday when I asked about his insurance policies. With so much at stake, maybe it's time we looked into getting a power of attorney. Just to protect him." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. She was weaponizing my age, twisting a fabricated moment of confusion into a justification for stripping me of my autonomy. The very idea was a violation, a cold-blooded attempt to declare me incompetent in my own life. That night, long after they had left, I sat alone in the living room as darkness filled the corners. The silence of the house was deafening. I started connecting the dots. The public insult at the wedding, the slow rearrangement of my home, the loaded questions about my finances, and now the whisper of my supposed senility. This wasn't random. It was a campaign, methodical and cruel. My greatest fear, the fear of becoming a burden, of losing the right to make my own decisions, was being engineered into reality by this woman. My gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to the framed photo of Sarah. She always used to say my quiet consistency was my greatest strength, but sitting there in the encroaching darkness, I wondered if my silence had been a terrible, fatal mistake. It was a Tuesday morning when Jessica called. Her voice on the phone was as smooth and sweet as honey. "I was hoping you'd let me take you to lunch, Dad, Jamie," she said. "Just the two of us, so we can get to know each other better." I've been around long enough to know when an invitation isn't really an invitation. It felt more like a summons, a formal notice to appear, but I agreed. Saying no would only make it look like I had something to hide, and I was tired of being backed into a corner in my own life. I decided right then that if she was setting a trap, I was going to walk into it with my eyes wide open. Before I left, I went to my closet and put on my best LL Bean flannel shirt, the one I usually save for holidays. It was a small thing, but I needed to feel grounded, to feel like myself. She had chosen a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with linen tablecloths so white they hurt your eyes, where they charge you for a bottle of water what I'd pay for a case of beer. The lighting was low and yellow, and the air was filled with the quiet, polite clinking of silverware. It was the complete opposite of my world. I felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a showroom, a feeling of being exposed and out of place. This wasn't a neutral meeting ground. This was her territory. An expensive, beautifully decorated cage. Jessica was already there, settled into a plush booth in a quiet corner, looking perfectly at home. She had chosen the stage, and I was the actor she'd summoned to play my part. The first few minutes of conversation were painstakingly awkward. She asked about my health, about my old days at the plant, about what I did to keep busy. The questions were all perfectly normal, but they were just a preamble, a way to fill the silence before the main event. There was no warmth in her eyes, just a patient, unnerving stillness. It was the look of a hunter waiting for the prey to take one more step into the clearing. I answered each question politely but briefly. I gave her facts, not feelings. I offered her nothing she could use, nothing she could grip onto. I made myself into a brick wall, patiently waiting to see what tool she planned to use to try and break through. After a waiter cleared away our appetizer plates, she reached into her expensive-looking handbag and placed a leather-bound folder on the table between us. The sound it made on the white tablecloth was soft, but it landed with the weight of a judge's gavel. "I took the liberty of doing some research," she said, her voice even and calm. "For the family's financial security, of course." My hands felt steady as I reached for it. I opened the cover. It wasn't filled with retirement planning brochures or articles about elder care. It was page after page of complex charts and diagrams, a web of arrows pointing from one shell corporation to another, from holding companies to offshore trusts. It was the entire intricate financial architecture that my wife and I had spent decades carefully, quietly building. My name was on every page, my signature, my decisions, my life's work. She had hired someone, a professional, to dig into every corner of my life. My privacy, the legacy I had built to protect my family, the memory of my wife's careful planning, all of it was laid bare on these cold, sterile pages. I slowly raised my eyes from the documents and looked at her. The pleasant smile was gone. Her face was now a mask of cool, hard determination. She didn't need to say another word. The folder on the table was her declaration of war. It said, "Everything I know, all your secrets. The hiding is over. From now on, we play by my rules." The shock of it was like a punch to the gut, but the feeling of betrayal was even worse. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an over-eager daughter-in-law. This was a calculated, meticulously planned assault. I wasn't dealing with an adversary anymore. I was dealing with an enemy. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the folder shut. Instead, a strange sort of calm washed over me, a clarity that pushed the chaotic emotions aside. My anger wasn't hot. It was cold. Cold and heavy like steel. With a deliberate, steady hand, I slowly closed the leather cover and placed the folder neatly beside my plate. I looked her directly in the eye. "What do you want, Jessica?" I asked. My voice was flat, even, stripped of all emotion. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Just a fraction of a second, but it was there. She had expected an explosion, a panicked denial, an old man's blustering rage. She hadn't expected this stillness. She hadn't expected me to meet her attack with a wall of ice. The pleasantries were over. The real conversation had just begun. Right there on that white tablecloth, a couple of days after that cold lunch, Dylan showed up at my door again. He looked worse this time, hollowed out, like he hadn't slept in a week. He didn't meet my eyes as he came in, slumping into the armchair that used to be his mother's. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was deeply troubled. "She's been crying for 2 nights straight, Dad," he began, his voice thick with a mixture of exhaustion and misery. "She feels so alone. She told me it feels like you're building these walls between us, shutting her out. All she wants is to help, to be part of this family." I sat there, completely stunned, the words hitting me like a physical blow. The air felt thin in my lungs. It was a move so devious, so perfectly twisted that I could almost admire the cruel artistry of it. She had taken her calculated, invasive attack on my life and reframed it as the heartbreak of a victim. My desperate, quiet attempt to hold onto my own ground was now being painted as an act of aggression, and I was the villain who was making his new daughter-in-law weep. I was speechless, caught in the gears of a machine I didn't know how to fight. How are we ever supposed to be a real family if you treat her like she's some kind of gold digger? Dylan's voice cracked, and I could hear the echo of Jessica's coaching in every syllable. He was reciting lines he'd been fed. Is that what you really think of the woman I love? It wasn't a question looking for an answer. It was an accusation, an ultimatum delivered with the full weight of his wounded heart. In that moment, she had successfully drawn a line in the sand, forcing my son into an impossible choice to defend the father who had taught him how to ride a bike and bait a hook, or protect the wife to whom he had just pledged his life. Looking at the torment in his face, the conflict warring in his eyes, I saw the outcome before it even settled. I saw the choice being made. He chose her. After that conversation, the silence began. Dylan's weekly calls, a simple ritual that had been a quiet cornerstone of my life for over a decade, just stopped. The first Sunday evening that passed without the phone ringing, I told myself he was busy, that they were just settling into their new life. But then the next Sunday came and went. The silence started to feel intentional, heavy. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a cold guest in my house. I finally broke and sent a text, 5 simple words, "Hope you're doing okay." Hours passed. Then the little notification appeared under my message, "Read." But no reply ever came. That single word, "read," was more brutal than any angry response. It was a confirmation. My message was received and my existence was ignored. The silence was a weapon, and it was being wielded with devastating precision. Every day that passed was another turn of the screw, a quiet, constant reminder that I had been successfully quarantined from the only family I had left. The house, once my sanctuary, began to feel like a prison. The familiar creak of the floorboards in the empty hallway seemed to mock my solitude. The steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the corner no longer felt comforting. It sounded like it was counting down the hours I was spending utterly alone. And in that crushing loneliness, a seed of doubt began to sprout. Maybe I was too stubborn. Maybe I was the one who misread everything. Was my pride getting in the way? The grief and confusion started to eat away at me from the inside. Some afternoons, I would just sit for hours in my worn lazy-boy, looking out the front window at the empty driveway, my mind replaying memories of Dylan as a kid, learning to ride his bike on that very patch of concrete. The ghost of his laughter seemed to hang in the air, a painful reminder of what I had lost. Then, after nearly 3 weeks of this agonizing silence, an email arrived. It was from Jessica. The subject line was a perfect piece of corporate-speak sentimentality for our family. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach as I opened it. She wrote that she understood my hesitation and knew that change could be hard, but that her only motivation was the happiness and security of the family. Then came the pitch. She proposed a solution to heal the divide, a legally structured family trust, a place where, in her saccharine words, all of us would have an equal voice in the big decisions. She dressed it up as an olive branch, a generous peace offering to bring a fractured family back together. But I saw it for what it was. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a Trojan horse, beautifully painted and presented, but filled with soldiers ready to take the city from within. I stared at the screen for a long time, then closed my laptop. I didn't reply. This time, my silence was different. It wasn't the silence of a man enduring his pain. It was the silence of refusal, a conscious, deliberate act of non-participation. I would not engage. I would not play her game anymore, but I knew this refusal would be interpreted as a declaration of war. It would only provoke her, push her to make her next move, likely something more aggressive. I felt like I was standing on the narrow edge of a cliff. Behind me was the vast empty ocean of the loneliness she had engineered, and in front of me, the sky was turning black. A storm was coming, and I knew I couldn't just stand there and let it hit me anymore. A week after Jessica's email went unanswered, a thick courier envelope arrived. It wasn't delivered by the regular mailman. It was a dedicated service, the kind with a crisp uniform and a scanner, sent from a high-end law firm downtown with a name that sounded like old money and ruthless efficiency. I signed for it and carried it into the kitchen. I placed it on the table and just stared at it for a long moment. It lay there looking official and ominous, a white rectangle of impending trouble. It wasn't a letter. It was a document. It had a physical weight to it that promised an even heavier emotional one. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I walked over to the coffee maker and brewed a pot, black and strong, the way I've had it every morning for 50 years. I needed the familiar ritual, the dark, bitter taste, to fortify myself. With the steaming mug in my hand, I finally sat down, took a deep breath, and slid open the seal. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that whatever was inside this envelope was going to change everything. Inside was a professionally bound proposal, nearly 50 pages long, for something called the Evans Legacy Trust. The language was a dense forest of legal jargon, clauses, and subclauses designed to be confusing. But I was patient. I spent the entire morning at that kitchen table, reading every single word, sometimes rereading a sentence 3 or 4 times until the meaning behind the complex phrasing became clear. It was a meticulously crafted plan. Jessica, with Dylan's complicity and the help of expensive lawyers, had outlined a structure that would consolidate my entire life's work. The trust was designed to manage all of my assets, the investment portfolio, the properties, the company itself, everything. It was a complete and total takeover, presented as prudent financial planning. And then on page 37, I found the heart of the trap. The section was titled Board of Trustees. The board would consist of 3 members, me, Dylan, and Jessica, and all decisions, from the smallest expenditure to the largest sale of assets, would be passed by a simple majority vote, 2 against 1. The cold, brutal math of it hit me like a physical shock. The jaws of the trap had been laid bare. With a 2-to-1 majority, they could do anything they wanted. They could liquidate the company my wife and I had bled for, sell off properties, redirect funds to ventures of their own, and I would be utterly powerless to stop it. My signature on this document would be a legal suicide. This wasn't a plan to protect my legacy. It was a blueprint for stealing it, cleanly and legally. My eyes drifted up to the portrait of my wife Sarah hanging on the dining room wall. I saw her smile, and a wave of protective anger, fierce and pure, washed over me. This wealth wasn't just mine, it was hers. I could still remember the nights she spent hunched over her drafting table, the endless calculations, the wastebasket overflowing with discarded sketches, and the bright, triumphant look in her eyes the day the patent was finally approved. This was her legacy. I was merely its caretaker, the man she had trusted to protect it. The thought of that legacy, her life's work, being controlled by the cold, greedy hands of a woman like Jessica, made my stomach churn with a visceral sickness. That night, sleep was impossible. The legal words from the proposal swam in my head. I got out of bed and walked down to my workshop in the basement, flipping on the single bare bulb that hung over my workbench. The familiar, comforting smell of motor oil, sawdust, and old steel wrapped around me like a blanket. This was the only room left where I felt completely like myself. My gaze swept over the tools hanging neatly on the pegboard, each one worn smooth by my hands, each one a memory of a problem solved, a thing built or repaired. I had taken enough. I had endured enough. My stoicism, my quiet refusal to cause a scene, the very traits I had always considered strengths, had been turned against me, used as weapons to paint me as weak and confused. But I am not a confused old man. I am an engineer. I was built to solve problems, and this was the most important problem of my life. I sat down on the creaking wooden stool at my workbench, the same one I'd used for 30 years. I reached for a clean sheet of paper from a drawer and picked up a well-worn pencil. I wasn't going to sign their documents. I wasn't going to call Dylan and start a screaming match. I was done reacting. I was done playing their game by their rules. It was time to build a new game entirely, my game. I began to write, sketching out the first steps of a plan, not a defense, but a counterattack. The cold anger I'd felt at that lunch table returned, but it had changed. It was no longer just an emotion swirling in my gut. It had cooled, hardened, and sharpened into something useful. It was fuel. It was time for the rustic antique to show them what happens when you try to break something that was forged in steel. I never wanted to do this. I want that to be perfectly clear. A man shouldn't have to resort to these kinds of methods within his own family. But they had pushed me, cornered me, and left me with no other path. That night, after making my decision, I remained in the quiet sanctuary of my workshop. I walked over to my old, heavy-duty steel tool cabinet, the one my father had left me, its gray paint chipped and scarred from decades of honest work. I knelt down, my knees protesting, and pulled on the handle of the bottom drawer. The metallic screech of the unoiled runners was the only sound in the basement, a noise so sharp and final it felt like chambering a round in a rifle. Beneath a pile of rags that still held the faint scent of oil and solvent, my fingers found what I was looking for. A small, discreet digital voice recorder and a plain manila folder I'd prayed I would never have to open. I'm not a spy or a lawyer. I don't think in terms of leverage and countermoves. I'm an engineer, and the first rule of engineering is that before you can fix a machine, you have to understand exactly how and why it's broken. My unease had taken root months ago. A persistent, thorny weed that sprouted after that disastrous lunch. A deep, paternal instinct, a gut feeling I couldn't shake, told me I was dealing with something far more calculated than I understood. So I had made a phone call I was deeply ashamed of. I'd called my old friend Frank, a retired private investigator who now spent his days trying to outsmart bass on Lake Erie. "Frank, I need to ask you for a favor," I'd said, the words feeling like gravel in my mouth. "I need you to look into my son's fiancée." There was a long pause on the other end. Frank knew me. He knew this went against the very fiber of my being. I hated myself for asking, for letting a stranger peer into the life of the woman my son loved. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I could almost hear my wife Sarah's voice. A gentle but firm whisper in my mind. "Be careful, Jamie. Protect what we built." So I swallowed my pride, listened to that voice, and made the call. Now, sitting under the pale yellow cone of light from my workbench lamp, I finally opened the folder Frank had sent me a month prior. Inside was the cold, unvarnished truth I'd been too afraid to face. It was a litany of quiet desperation. Credit reports detailing a mountain of debt that Jessica's family was buried under. Unpaid student loans, maxed out credit cards, a mortgage on a house they clearly couldn't afford. They weren't just struggling, they were on the precipice of financial ruin. Their precarious situation suddenly explained Jessica's ruthless haste. It didn't excuse her actions, not for a second, but it gave them a grim, pathetic logic. This was a rescue mission for her, and my life's work was the lifeboat. Then, I came to the last item in the folder, a small black USB drive. I plugged it into an old beat-up laptop I kept in the shop for schematics and put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I didn't want the sound of this to pollute the one space I had left that felt clean and honest. I clicked play. Jessica's voice filled my ears, stripped of all its practiced sweetness. It was a recorded phone call with a friend, made shortly after she and Dylan got engaged. "Of course it's not about love," she said, her tone a casual, cynical drawl that chilled me to the bone. "It's about securing the future. It's a business plan." The clip was only 30 seconds long, but it was long enough to shatter the last flickering ember of hope that I had somehow gotten it all wrong. This was never about family. It was a hostile takeover, planned from the beginning. The next day, my resolve hardened into something solid and heavy. I picked up the phone and called Dylan. "I think we should talk," I said, my voice deliberately calm and steady. "You and Jessica. Come over to the house tonight. I've reviewed the proposal for the trust and I'm ready to give my answer." I could almost feel his relief, his smug satisfaction radiating through the phone. He thought I was finally surrendering. He thought their pressure campaign had worked. That evening, I prepared the living room like I was setting a stage. I didn't turn on the bright overhead lamp, opting instead for a single floor lamp that cast long shadows in the corners. I wanted the atmosphere to be sober, serious. On the coffee table, directly in the center, I placed two folders. One was their thick, professionally bound proposal full of legal clauses. The other, much slimmer, was my own. When they arrived, Jessica swept in with the confident, beaming smile of a victor who had come to collect her prize. Dylan followed in her wake, looking relieved that the unpleasantness was finally over. They sat down together on the sofa. I took my seat in my armchair, facing them across the table. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting them savor what they thought was their triumph. Then, without a word, I leaned forward and slowly pushed my thin manila folder across the polished wood surface. Jessica picked it up, a flicker of condescending confusion on her face. She opened it. I watched her eyes scan the first page. I saw the color drain from her cheeks as she read the summary of her family's credit report. I saw the confident set of her shoulders begin to slump. Then, her eyes fell on the small USB drive tucked into an interior pocket. Her gaze shot up to meet mine. My silence, my methodical approach, was clearly more terrifying to her than any angry outburst could have been. For the first time since I'd met her, the mask of unshakable control was gone, and in its place was the dawning, panicked recognition that this rustic antique still had a few sharp teeth left. Not a single word was spoken. Jessica's face was a pale, blank mask as she slowly closed the folder. She rose from the sofa with a stiff, unnatural grace, a marionette whose strings had just been cut. Dylan, his eyes darting from my face to hers in utter helpless confusion, scrambled to his feet. He opened his mouth as if to ask a question, but no sound came out. They walked out of the living room, and a moment later, the sound of the front door closing echoed through the quiet house. It was a hollow, final sound that seemed to seal the silence in with me. I sat there in my armchair for a long time, the two folders still sitting on the coffee table, one a symbol of her aggression, the other a symbol of my sad victory. For a brief, foolish moment, I allowed a fragile tendril of hope to take root in my chest. I thought that maybe, just maybe, the cold, hard shock of the truth would be enough. That being confronted with her own calculated greed, laid bare in a manila folder, would be enough to make her retreat, to reconsider. I imagined a phone call, a difficult but necessary conversation where the deception fell away. I was wrong. I had treated it like a problem with a logical solution. I'd forgotten I wasn't dealing with a rational actor. I was dealing with a desperate one, and I had profoundly underestimated the lengths that desperation would drive her to. The quiet truce lasted less than 2 weeks. Then, a certified letter arrived. It wasn't in a normal envelope. It was in a large, stiff one that felt heavy with importance. A mail carrier I didn't recognize stood on my porch, holding a scanner and asking for my signature. I knew before I even opened it. Good news never comes with a tracking number and a witness. The letterhead was from her law firm, the name embossed in heavy, authoritative script. Inside, the dry, sterile language of the law filled the page, a dense thicket of clauses and statutes. But the message, when I finally hacked my way through the jargon, was as clear as a declaration of war. They had filed a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, alleging potential irregularities in the beneficial ownership reporting of my corporate structures. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just an escalation. This was a scorched earth tactic. This was no longer a messy family dispute fought in the quiet of my living room. She was weaponizing the full, crushing weight of the federal government against me. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter spread out before me, a document that felt radioactive to the touch. A wave of exhaustion, deeper and heavier than any physical fatigue I had ever known, settled into my bones. I've spent my entire life playing by the rules, believing in the simple virtues of hard work, paying your taxes, and honest dealing. And now, the very system I had trusted was being twisted into a club to beat me with. The thought of depositions, of sharp-suited lawyers and investigators poring over every financial decision I'd ever made, of the sheer, grinding, soul-crushing stress of a federal inquiry. At my age, it felt like an impossible mountain to climb. She knew it would. This was a war of attrition designed to bleed me dry financially and spiritually. She was willing to burn the whole forest down just to get the rabbit. My first instinct, a desperate paternal urge, was to call Dylan. I had to make him understand the gravity of this, the irrevocable line that his wife had just crossed. I dialed his number, my heart pounding with a wild, desperate hope that I could make him see reason. When he answered, I started to explain about the letter, the SEC, the legal nightmare she had just unleashed. But his voice on the other end was like ice. "She's just trying to protect our future, Dad," he said, his tone flat and rehearsed. Then, something in him snapped. His voice rose, cracking with a raw, agonizing blend of anger and hurt. "She was trying to bring this family together, but you treated her like a criminal. You had her investigated. The father I knew would never, ever do that." The line went dead. The silence that followed was more violent than his shouting. Each of his words had landed like a hammer blow to my chest. This was a betrayal so profound it eclipsed everything else. It wasn't Jessica's attack that wounded me, it was my own son's defense of it. In his eyes, her aggression was justified, and my self-defense was a monstrous crime. I had become the villain in my own life story. Every lesson I had ever tried to teach him about honor and integrity felt like it had turned to ash in my mouth. Jessica hadn't just come for my money, she had successfully stolen my son. I placed the phone back in its cradle, my hand trembling so badly I had to use my other to guide it. The shame I felt at the wedding was a pinprick compared to this gaping wound. This pain was different. This was the kind of pain that could break a man. I sat in the dark for a long, long time that night, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, and in that darkness a cold, grim clarity emerged. I finally understood that I could not win this fight, not in any way that mattered. Every move I made to defend myself, every piece of evidence I presented, only pushed Dylan further away and cemented my role as the antagonist in the narrative Jessica had so skillfully woven. I was trapped. To save my relationship with my son, or what little was left of it, I had to lose the war with his wife. The only way to win was to end the fight itself. A new plan began to form in my mind, not born of anger or a desire for victory, but of sheer pragmatic necessity. It was a plan that felt like a surrender. It would be costly, but maybe, just maybe, the chance to one day look my son in the eye and not see an enemy was worth more than any amount of money or pride. The morning after that long, dark night of the soul, I woke up a different man. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but the confusion and the weariness were gone. In their place was a cold, hard clarity. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer. "Tom," I said, and my voice was so steady it barely sounded like my own. "I need you to set up a meeting. My son, my daughter-in-law, and their legal counsel, your office, as soon as possible." Tom, who's handled my affairs for more than 20 years, heard the change immediately. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Jamie, are you sure about this?" "Oh, yeah. Haven't even begun to formulate a defense for the SEC complaint." "I'm sure," I said. "It's time to end this." I didn't offer any more explanation. I just gave him a simple, direct set of instructions, like I was reading from an engineering schematic. There was no emotion, only procedure. The part of me that was a grieving father had been walled off. The part of me that was a problem solver was now in complete control. A few days later, we were all gathered in a conference room at Tom's firm. It was a deliberately neutral space, cold and impersonal. The room had no windows, just 4 beige walls, a long polished mahogany table, and a dozen black leather chairs that sighed when you sat in them. I had arrived 30 minutes early and taken the seat at the head of the table, the one that faced the door. I hadn't brought a briefcase or a single sheet of paper. All I had with me was the weight of my decision. When they walked in, Jessica, Dylan, and a slick-looking lawyer in a suit that probably cost more than my first car, the atmosphere in the room thickened. Jessica had a look of serene confidence, the practiced poise of someone who believes she holds all the cards. Her lawyer mirrored her smugness. Dylan, however, wouldn't look at me. He stared at the floor, at the wall, at his own hands, anywhere but at my face. He looked utterly miserable, a man caught in a machine he didn't understand. Jessica's lawyer began the proceedings, his voice a smooth, condescending drone. He talked about the SEC filing, about the fiduciary duty to ensure transparency, about his client's sincere desire to protect the family's assets for future generations. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt, didn't shift in my seat. I just sat there, perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the table in front of me. And I never took my eyes off Jessica. I ignored her lawyer. I ignored my son. I stared directly at her, letting her feel the full, unnerving pressure of my silence. I wanted her to know, before I even spoke a word, that the game she had invented was over. When her lawyer finally paused to take a breath, I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't address him at all. I spoke directly to Jessica, and my voice was calm, cold, and utterly devoid of the warmth she had once known. It was a voice that even I didn't fully recognize. $5 million, I said into the silent room. The effect was instantaneous. The lawyer's mouth, which had been open to continue his speech, remained agape. Tom, my own lawyer, looked at me in disbelief. Dylan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Jessica just stared, her mask of confidence finally cracking. "It will be wired to an account of your choosing within the hour," I continued, my gaze unwavering. In exchange, you will sign a non-disclosure agreement. You will withdraw the SEC complaint, and you will relinquish any and all present and future claims to the Evans estate. And you will never, under any circumstances, contact me or my son again. "Dad!" Dylan started, his voice a choked whisper. But I raised a single hand to silence him, never breaking eye contact with his wife. "This is not a negotiation," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "This is your exit. You can take it or you can refuse it. But if you refuse, we will go to war, not just in court, but everywhere. I will spend every last dollar I have making sure the entire world knows exactly who and what you are." For the very first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of losing money. It was the primal fear of public permanent exposure. Her lawyer, recovering his senses, puffed out his chest. "My client will not be intimidated by—" he began to bluster. But Jessica held up a hand, silencing him instantly. She was a calculator, and the numbers were running in her head. A guaranteed, tax-free $5 million right now with no risk. Or a protracted, brutal, and deeply uncertain legal battle where the secrets from my folder could become public record, destroying her reputation and her future prospects forever. The power in the room had shifted so completely it was almost a physical force. The siege was over. The fortress was no longer surrounded. I was now the one dictating the terms of surrender. And in the cold, windowless room, we all knew with absolute certainty that she was going to sign the papers. There wasn't much haggling after that. The finality of my offer had sucked all the air out of their argument. The paperwork was drawn up with an efficiency that told me Tom had anticipated this outcome and had the documents ready to go. I sat in my chair at the head of the table, a silent observer to the dismantling of my own life's work. The lawyers spoke in low, clipped tones, trading legal phrases back and forth like chess pieces. I tuned them out. I wasn't interested in the fine print anymore. My focus was entirely on Jessica. She read through the agreement with a speed and intensity that was purely predatory. Her eyes, cold and sharp, scanned the pages, skipping over the dense legal clauses and slowing only when they landed on the paragraphs that detailed the numbers and the wire transfer instructions. There was no hint of remorse or sadness in her posture. This wasn't the somber end of a family relationship for her. It was the final review before closing a deal. When she reached the last page, she picked up the expensive-looking fountain pen Tom's assistant had provided. She signed her name with a quick, decisive slash of ink. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just the clean, cold signature of a transaction completed. Tom took the signed document, reviewed it, and then picked up his desk phone. The room fell into a deep silence, broken only by his low, steady voice as he read off account numbers and security codes to someone on the other end, authorizing the transfer. It was surreal, hearing the work of a lifetime, the sum of my wife's genius and my own decades of sweat, reduced to a string of digits spoken into a telephone. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, he hung up. He looked across the table at me and gave a single, solemn nod. "It's done," he said. A wave of visible relief washed over Jessica's face, a subtle loosening of the tension in her jaw that she couldn't quite conceal. As she glanced at her lawyer, the corner of her mouth twitched upwards into a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. It wasn't a smile of relief from a stressful ordeal. It was the unmistakable smile of victory, the quiet, satisfied expression of someone who had just won the jackpot. But I wasn't the only one who saw it. All this time, Dylan had been sitting beside her, a ghost at the proceedings, his face pale and drawn. He had been staring at the polished surface of the table, lost in his own private misery. But when Tom confirmed the transfer, Dylan's head came up. He looked at his wife, and he saw that little smile. And in that instant, I watched the world break behind my son's eyes. Oh, the entire narrative she had built for him, the story of a loving wife fighting for her family's future against a stubborn, untrusting old man, shatter into a million pieces. The carefully constructed illusion evaporated in the harsh fluorescent light of that conference room. In that one tiny, triumphant smirk, he finally saw her not as his wife, but as she truly was, a businesswoman who had just successfully closed a very profitable deal. Slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. My face must have looked ancient in that moment, etched with the fatigue of a battle I never wanted to fight, but my eyes were steady. And as he looked at me, the full crushing weight of his own misjudgment, his own blindness, seemed to land on his shoulders. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. But his eyes, filled with a dawning horror, a profound shame, and a bottomless well of regret, were a silent apology more powerful than any words he could have spoken. In that single, shared glance, I knew. I had just lost $5 million, but I'd gotten my son back, and it was a trade I would make again in a heartbeat. Jessica and her lawyer stood up, all business now. They gathered their papers with a brisk efficiency, eager to leave before anyone could change their mind. Dylan remained seated, frozen, staring at the empty space on the table where the documents had been. I rose from my chair, walked around the table, and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. It felt heavy, burdened. "Let's go, son," I said, my voice softer than it had been in months. Together, we walked out of that cold, airless building and into the bright afternoon sun. The fresh air felt like a miracle, like the first breath after being underwater for too long. The war was over. The bone-deep exhaustion settled over me, but it was a different kind of tired now. It was the fatigue that comes after a long fever has finally broken. Leaving that law office, I felt relieved, but also empty. $5 million is a heavy price to pay for peace. It got me thinking. For all the fathers and grandfathers out there listening, what's the most valuable lesson about money and legacy you've tried to pass on to your children and grandchildren? I'm not talking about what's written in a will, but the real lessons, the ones learned through living. I'd be honored to read your thoughts in the comments. A week went by. A week of deep, profound quiet, of letting the dust from the explosions settle in the silent corners of my house. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the doorbell rang. The chime echoed through the stillness, and I knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, who was on the other side. I walked to the door, my footsteps feeling heavy on the hardwood floor. I looked through the small peephole. It was Dylan, standing alone on the porch, looking like a ghost of the son I knew. He was thinner, his skin pale, and he held himself with a defeated slump that broke my heart. He wasn't looking at the door, but down at the welcome mat, like a man preparing to receive a verdict he knew he deserved. I opened the door, and we just stood there for a long, heavy moment, the screen door the only thing between us. I could see the war he had been through etched on his face, the deep, gut-wrenching shame warring with a desperate hope in his eyes. He finally looked up at me. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice raspy, broken. I didn't say a word. I just stepped back and held the main door open wide, a silent invitation. It was all that was needed. It was forgiveness, an acknowledgement, and a welcome home, all contained in that simple, quiet gesture. He walked into the living room, a space he knew as well as his own reflection, and sank down onto the sofa. He looked around at the familiar furniture and the photos on the mantelpiece, as if he were a stranger, or worse, an exile returning to a land he no longer felt worthy of. Finally, his gaze settled on me, and the full weight of his regret was in his eyes. "Dad, I'm sorry." Those 3 words, spoken into the quiet of the room, were stripped bare of any excuse or justification. They didn't try to explain or lessen his role. They were just the pure, unvarnished truth of his remorse, and because of that, they were enough. They were the foundation stone upon which something new could be built. I felt a tension in my own shoulders, a knot I didn't even know I was carrying, finally begin to release. I gave a slow nod. "I know, son," I said. I went to the kitchen, my movements feeling lighter than they had in months, and came back with 2 cold bottles of Budweiser, condensation beating on the brown glass. I handed one to him, and our fingers brushed. It was a ritual we'd shared 1,000 times, the unspoken peace treaty after a long day's work. The following Saturday, he came back. He didn't call first this time. His old Ford truck just quietly pulled into the driveway. He was wearing a pair of faded Levi's and a grease-stained t-shirt, the clothes of the boy I'd raised, not the man in the expensive suit I'd seen at the wedding. "I was thinking about that '68 Mustang in the garage," he said, a hesitant smile touching his lips. "Is the carburetor still giving you trouble?" A real smile, the first in what felt like a lifetime, spread across my face. "It's always giving me trouble," I said. "It's its job." We spent the rest of the afternoon in the garage, the wide door rolled up to let in the crisp autumn air. We didn't talk about Jessica. We didn't talk about the money or the lawyers or the pain. We talked about champion spark plugs and the viscosity of Mobil 1 oil. We talked about the satisfying clank of a wrench tightening a bolt and the deep, throaty rumble of a V8 engine. The smell of gasoline and old grease, the shared space under the hood of that old car, the comfortable silence punctuated only by the sound of metal on metal. This was our language. It's how the men in my family have always spoken to each other, how we've mended fences and said the things that are too difficult for words, working shoulder to shoulder, our hands covered in the same grime, our focus on the same broken thing. I could feel more than just an engine being repaired. The bond between us, which had been so badly fractured, was being carefully, methodically put back together. Not with apologies, but with action, with presence, with the shared, honest work of fixing something that was broken. This morning, I sat on my front porch, a warm mug of coffee in my hands, and watched the sunrise paint the sky. The house feels peaceful again. Dylan and I are finding our rhythm, slowly, carefully. The war with Jessica cost me a great deal, but in the end, it gave me something far more valuable in return, the unvarnished truth. And it taught my son a lesson about character, a lesson that no inheritance ever could. A legacy isn't about the number of zeros in a bank account. It's not about shell corporations or legacy trusts. A true legacy is about honesty. It's about self-respect. It's about being able to look your son in the eye and know that he respects the man you are, not the things you own. My wife, Sarah, she always knew that. Her patent created the wealth, but it was her love, her integrity, and her wisdom that were the real inheritance I was fighting to protect all along. My story is coming to a close, but I know there are thousands of fathers and grandfathers out there fighting their own quiet battles, feeling invisible and unheard. If you're one of them, listening to my voice right now, please know this: you are not alone. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Don't ever let anyone take that away from you.